Beth Kobliner is one of the nation's leading authorities on personal finance. I measure this fact by the fact that she's been on Sesame Street, and which I find I'm pretty starstruck now. In addition, she also served on President Obama's Advisory Council for Financial Capability for Young Americans. So however you want to measure it, Beth knows what she's talking about. So please welcome Beth Kobliner.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for coming. You've been on a pretty big book tour so far, right?
Yeah, I was in Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, Ann Arbor, and now I'm going for the next leg, leaving on Thursday to the West Coast. So a lot going on. It's fascinating to be meeting parents with kids of all ages. I look at you all as kids. And so it's great. I wanted to just say two quick things. Is that okay, just to start?
Totally.
The first is my dad is in the audience. He's 87 years old, Harold Kobliner. And it's very cute because my dad, he was an educator, a principal, then chairman of what's called the Board of Examiners, which was the organization that tested teachers, principals, and superintendents in New York City. And he also was a great role model about money, and he loves, to this day, to go into the local supermarket and hand out flyers about my book to anyone he meets. He actually single-handedly sold 4 copies in Barnes & Noble on the Upper West Side yesterday. Just like talking to parents, oh, my daughter wrote this book. Simon & Schuster said we had a real spike in sales on the Upper West Side. And so he hands out flyers, and he always just gives them to people in stores who he really likes and who are helpful. And in addition to giving him like the freshest soy milk in the back, they also often say to him, thank you for teaching me these secrets. I didn't know these basic money issues. And that's always been very touching to him and touching to me and my mom. And I just wanted to say that the reason I wrote the book was basically to share that wisdom that I grew up with and have been writing about for 30 years with people. So that was the first thing. And the second thing is, I'm old, so I've been on Oprah and taught Elmo about money and met with President Obama about children and money. But the one thing, now my daughter's 21 and my son's 18, and the little one's 13, and the one thing they've been impressed by, I'm speaking at Google today. And they're like, no way, wow. So Google, I've never been here. It's really exciting, and I know how smart you all are.
Thank you. And we definitely do still, I'm sure, have things to learn from this book. So.
Maybe 1 or 2.
I don't know. I felt like I learned a lot reading it. Because the book works off the premise that parents should be teaching their kids good money habits from preschool all the way through young adulthood. And you say in the book that a child's basic money habits are formed by the age of 7,
right?
Which I hope is not terrifying to any parents of 10-year-olds in the audience. Sorry. What sorts of things are kids under 7 picking up on that are really locking in those habits?
Right. Well, there's some really good research done by a woman named Corinne Holden at University of Wisconsin. And I met her on Sesame Street. I should say I met her on the street, Sesame Street. But I did, and she's done some remarkable research looking at what 3-year-olds understand. And she found they understand exchange. When you give money for something, more like if you give a card for something, they get something back. They see that happening. They understand value. A diamond ring is more valuable than a pair of shoes, although it depends what shoes you're talking about. And also, they understand the basic concept of needs versus wants. So if you go shopping in a supermarket with a young child, you can say, you know what, we really need milk, but we really want chocolate milk, or we really need vegetables, but we really want potato chips. And we're gonna spend most of our money on things we need, and you could play the game, need, want game. And then, and as a kid gets older, you're like, how do we find the less expensive brand? And what are the trade-offs and all those sort of things you could do in a supermarket? But I think it's key that talking to kids at very young ages, as little as 3, really has an impact on having them understand these concepts more and more, which is really, I was surprised by that. I didn't really realize that. And then the scary one was Cambridge University did a study, and they said by age 7, many of those behaviors that we associate with money habits are actually set by age 7. So I think they're talking more about like delayed gratification and executive function, but it's not that it's absolutely set. There's a lot more to teach an 8-year-old up, I think, and that comes from everyday moments, whether it's talking to your kid about, okay, I'm gonna go buy a car. It's my editor. He got my book and he's like, I never would have thought of that, but I brought my 10-year-old to the car dealership because I would think, she'd be bored, but I brought her and I started telling her, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna buy a car. This is what the price is. I'm gonna try to negotiate. I'm gonna get an interest rate. Maybe I'll go to a bank for the interest rate. And those conversations are and those experiences, frankly, are pretty meaningful for kids. It's with everything digital and online, I think it's really essential that parents start doing that at many ages, as kids get older.
Yeah, to a certain extent, that sounds like an extension of good parenting.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Explain to your kid why you're doing what you're doing.
Right.
Let them into those decisions.
Yeah.
Make sure that things that would otherwise go unspoken are sort of explained and
Right.
clarified. What happens to a kid whose parents don't consciously make an effort to teach them about money and finance?
Yeah, what we're seeing is, 2 years ago, the government participated in this international test for 15-year-olds, and it's called PISA, is the test. And what was ironic, I was on the President's Council at the time, and we couldn't come up with the $200,000 to participate in this test, which okay, as a government, but we did, and we were able to take this test, and we found that 15-year-olds in the United States are mediocre, right in the middle. So there are countries, many countries from all over that are doing so much better than we are in teaching kids basics. And we're talking basics, understanding the interest rate on a credit card, or even being able to dissect a paycheck, not understanding where that money's going, whether it's Social Security or tax, so I have in my book a chart on all that. But I also, it's so clear that our nation, by not someone I work with said, financial rights are civil rights. And if you understand that it's a mistake to get into credit card debt that's charging you 18%, or if you understand that if you miss a student loan payment, that will likely go on your credit record for 7 years. Those kind of things, I've had so many people tell me, I didn't know, and I want my kids to know and to understand this, in age-appropriate ways.
Yeah, it's interesting where you just said that one way of looking at it is that, financial issues are civil rights issues. Because you mentioned a statistic in the book that nearly half of all Americans couldn't pull together $2,000 for an emergency.
Yeah.
And this isn't just half of all Americans don't have $2,000 in the
Exactly.
bank, but they wouldn't be able to borrow it from friends and family. They could not get
Right, they couldn't even
$2,000.
get it, you think, oh, we'll use your credit card. They didn't have access to credit to get $2,000. So it probably means that we don't know exactly, but probably means that they are in credit trouble and they were no longer had a line of credit. So when you think of that, that's pretty terrifying. It's financial, I've heard it called financial fragility, or we're so unsecure. We're not financially secure. And I think that is so important, just the concept of, saving up money. And the more I've been touring, I really strongly believe, and you're Google, you could help me make this happen. I think cash should come back. I really think that. I'm not getting any nods. You're like, nah. But when I was a kid, my parents would sit at the kitchen table and my mom and dad would pay the bills together, and there were a pile of bills, and they'd write a check and they balance their check. How many people here balance a checkbook, honestly? One person. So interesting. my dad could stand up and tell you how many, over 87 years, how many times he found errors in the bank math. But anyway, so, and I know you're all making a decision of like time versus money, and my time is worth more than checking to find the $10 mistake. So, but sometimes there are mistakes, and I think for kids, my favorite story in the book is a mom going to Target with her son, and he was about 8 or 9, and she was buying juice boxes, and she pulled out a 20, and her kid said, "Mommy, don't pay for it. Use the card. That's the way you get it for free if you use the card." And I think that mindset, particularly for younger kids, and of course now Venmo and all the ways people are exchanging money without exchanging money, and we know that MIT did a study years ago showing that people spend twice as much if you use a card than if you use cash. And I think the pain of paying is something when you fork over dollars, it feels like, oh, I'm really giving up something. That's a behavioral economics finding. So I think the inability to make a connection between I'm buying things and I'm going into a bank and I'm getting money, instead of it all being online, or I think that is something that children are missing out on. And a great parent would say, "Hey, come on over, I'm paying the bills online." But it doesn't really look like any different to a 4-year-old or 5-year-old than someone doing work, because it's hard to sort of make that connection versus the concrete experience.
So in the book, you advocate against giving, middle schoolers and teenagers prepaid debit cards, like have them work on cash.
Yeah.
But it sounds also like adults would benefit from working in cash too.
I think, or at least modeling it for your child. I mean, that's how I learned to make change. I had about 4 jobs in high school, and one of them was working at the local diner. I'm from Queens originally, and that was one of my first jobs. And I was in AP Math, but that was my top subject. We both bonded. We went to Brown, so, but English major. Yeah. But when I was making change, I remember that it would be like $3.84 bill, and they'd give me a 10. So I try to subtract it in my head, and my dad's like, "No, you just count up. If it's 34 cents, a penny for 35, then counting up all the way to $10. And I learned that with cash, and I think just the counting, people not little kids not knowing coins or dollar bills, I think that's all part of it, and I think that is all important. Not that we will get rid of our credit cards, they're super convenient, but if you're, of course, using a credit card and you're paying it off in full, it's good to do that, it's good to have a credit record, but I think that that's been pushed way too early, and I think kids are missing out.
Yeah. So we've already touched on a couple of specific bits of advice. A big one that comes up in the book that I thought was really interesting, because it's one that is so distant in my memory, is allowances. Mm-hmm. So what is your take on giving kids an allowance? What are the learning opportunities there? What do you think about that?
Right. So this study at University of Minnesota, and I have to say, this one wasn't a randomized controlled study, but it was interesting in that they followed children who were given chores when they were little, and they, whether it's making the bed or whatever they were doing regularly, and they found that having chores not tied to money, but just chores as part of a family, that's your responsibility, we're a team, we're all in together, that was one predictor of a child's success in terms of certain milestones, like graduating from high school or graduating from school in general, or starting a career. That experience of doing a job as part of a family was quite important to a child's development. But when you put money into the equation and you give kids money for chores, it takes away from that intrinsic value of, I'm gonna work hard for my family, we're in this together, and it dilutes it. Same with Roland Fryer, great guy. He did research on giving kids money for grades. How many people got money for grades? Like most of you not, because your parents said you work hard, and whether you were born with it or you were instilled with it, this desire to work hard, for working hard's sake. And maybe they're like, we all knew, like, one day I'll get to Google, and you did it. But I think that idea of parents instilling that in kids, so it doesn't work. Roland Fryer, in a wonderfully randomized control study, said that giving kids money and saying, I'll give you an A, I'll give you $100 if you get an A, or $50 if you get an A, doesn't work.
Is it the same for a gift or another kind of reward?
If you reward afterwards, that's different.
Okay.
If the kid does really well and you just want to take them out for ice cream, that's a different thing. But if it's given as an incentive, yeah, any kind of gift or reward doesn't work. But so the question of allowance. So given that you want to give allowance, you can give allowance. And I looked into 24 studies on allowance. There were international studies. And one from Canada found that when people give their children allowance, the kids end up being a little more responsible with money and they save a little more. The study from England found when parents give their kids allowance, the kids are feeling more entitled and they're not. So there is sort of no one right answer with allowance. But what I have found overall is you want to be clear to your child and in your own mind what this allowance is for. So if it's like a really little kid, like a 10-year-old, it's good to say, okay, this is going to be, you have 6 Lego kits. If you want another one, and it's not your birthday and it's not the holidays and grandma and grandpa aren't getting it from it, you have to save up for that. And you figure out what that would roughly cost. Because I think one mistake parents can make is, I think back, like, well, when I was a kid, I got $1 for babysitting, and now people get $20 an hour for babysitting. So sort of thinking of what it really costs, and then having kids make choices. And you can buy the Doritos on your way home, and you learn opportunity cost. Or you could put that dollar into a jar or a piggy bank or whatever and save it up. And then kids see that excitement of building up that money. So I think allowance works like that. You can also give just a regular allowance once a week. The rules of thumb are give a kid's age, 10-year-old gets $10 a week. But when I'm talking about this in the Midwest, the moms are like, I would like $520 handed to me a year. So it really just depends. I think, as a parent, we really got most serious about this when our kids were going to college and said, okay, how do we come up with a realistic amount that they were lucky, they don't have to take out student loans, and they were in a situation where we will pay for their health care and books. But so if we wanted to get, they both work, but if we give them a little bit of cash for that semester, how much, should it be and what would it be expected for? So of course I'm like, I'll just give them $100. And then we were thinking about it, like, no, this is money for if they want to go on a trip with a friend or they want to go. So my daughter, for example, went skiing, even though she doesn't ski, to kids these days. She went over winter break. A bunch of friends were going to Canada, and they were driving up, but she had to go later. So we saw her sitting there looking at the train versus the plane, and the train took 9 hours and the plane took 2 hours, and she made the choice to take the train. And of course I'm thinking, maybe we'll just let her take the plane, it's so long. And then my husband and I were talking about, no, this is to each other. We didn't do this in front of her, but that the idea that, this is what we agreed to, and this is so good for her to be making those choices. And she had fun on the train. She looked out the window, and I did my homework, and I read a lot. I read a novel. And so those, I think at every level, when you're a parent, the hardest part is coming up with something and then sticking with it.
Yeah, that consistency.
Consistency.
There ends up being a big shift, though, around, I don't know if it happens in middle school, like babysitting jobs, or in high school. Once I remember just like waiting to be 16 so I could get a job. I was so excited. But it seems like from the research you found, it's a mix of, some benefits, but also some possible sacrifices with high school jobs, especially, during the school year.
Right, exactly. There are a lot of great books in the last few years have come out that talked about kids are, they're coddled too much and they should be out working in high school like we used to do. And that I agree with for sure, in theory and in practice. However, the Department of Labor Statistics did an analysis, and they found that if a child is working like 12 hours, 13 hours a week, then it doesn't have a negative impact on their grades. In fact, it may give them a teeny boost in grades, and it could be because they're using their time efficiently. But once you get to that 15-hour or over mark, it has an impact on grades. So we know that when kids do less homework in math, it's a direct correlation to their math grades. And then, of course, when we're talking about thinking about college and not just how great a school you get into, but also which will give you the most aid and opening up your opportunities to get more aid. I think it's a hard trade-off, and of course there are many, many, many families that need their child to work to contribute to the family. But I think it's important just to know that number. Whereas in college, interestingly, you can work up to 20 hours. Kids who work up to 20 hours but work in an on-campus job have slightly higher GPAs than kids that don't work at all.
Yeah, and then there's also the question of, is that work important preparation for future careers and things like that?
Right.
And so you, in the book, I think you advocate for college students working during the summer, maybe as a trade-off for working less during the school year?
Absolutely. I think working in the summer for high school and college, and then that job during high school, for example, if it's during the summer, it's sort of a great way to then segue to, with your kids, to the magic of compound interest, which is a hard one to, talk to a 14-year-old about. This is great, compound interest. And the idea is, if a child is, say, 14, and they work every summer, and maybe they earn $1,000 for that summer, and they work for 4 summers in a row, and if they put that money into like a Roth IRA, and in order to open a Roth IRA, you need to have income, so it has to be from the job. So you put that $1,000 in each year for 4 years, and then you stop and never put money in again. You would most likely, if you put it in an index fund or ETF, and I talk about those in my book, you would be likely to have over $100,000. So saying that to a kid, you do it for these 4 years, that's how much you're going to have. That's fairly compelling, I think, for many kids. And also it helps if you're applying for financial aid, because colleges expect you to contribute much more of a kid's savings than a parent's savings. So, but if it's in an IRA, they don't look at that money typically, which is, it's a good thing to know.
Yeah. There's so many trade-offs. But you do.
Sorry.
No. It's all really clear in the book, though. There are a lot of little worksheets and tables that I found really helpful.
Thank you.
And we were saying the book starts or includes in every chapter ways to introduce these ideas to a preschooler, whether it's just playing with coins or talking about wants and needs. But you also take all of the advice past college into young adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And so how much input on a 23, 24-year-old's financial life do you think a parent should be having?
I think a lot of guidance is needed, either because they didn't talk about it before, or kids are graduating. And if you don't mind me asking one more question, how many people here have student loans that they're still paying off? No. The Brown major.
No, we're talking about grad school too.
Yeah, grad school, including grad school. No, you all paid it off. But I think that many people graduate from college with lots of student debt. And if it's federal student debt, there are a lot of wonderful repayment options. And I met someone here who worked at one of these companies that will also refinance private student loans. Typically, if you're from a school that they sort of makes the list of schools that they think those kids have a likelihood to pay off their debt to. It's interesting. But I think that talking about repayment options, moving back home is something that, it's so interesting. And one part of the country I said, to college, you have to move back home. And they're like, ah. And then another part of the country, I actually spoke to these kids. It's called College Advising Corps. And these are kids who graduate from high school, and it's like a Peace Corps, but for working in lower income high schools that don't have college counselors. And these kids volunteer for 2 years, and they learn as much as they possibly can about being a college counselor and helping kids with financial aid. And when I sort of said, well, move back home, kids said, I'm from the Bronx and I have 4 siblings and we live in a 1-room apartment. I can't move back home. So I'm like, okay, so the perspective there can be, but I do think there's so much we can do to educate people. I mean, I have one quick story about my dad. And a lot of the book is about delayed gratification and the marshmallow experiment that Walter Mischel is a professor. He was at Stanford, now he's at Columbia. And he did an experiment with 5-year-olds. And he put a marshmallow in front of them. And then he said, look, you can eat this marshmallow now, feel free. But if you wait, I'm going to bring you a second marshmallow. And they did this when kids are 5. And they found, and then he tracked these kids for years and years and years, and now those kids are in their 50s. But when he did that experiment, he'd walk out of the room, the examiner would walk out of the room, and some kids would be like, they'd eat the marshmallow right away. But some kids would wait, and they'd wait, and they wait, and they would usually, whistle or try to distract themselves, and then they would wait for him for 15 minutes to come back, and they got that marshmallow, that second marshmallow. And they found that those kids who waited had, on average, 200 points higher on their SATs. I feel like I should start a prep course, like a SAT course with that in mind. I don't know how. Someone here could help me figure it out. 200 points higher on their SATs. They reported having happier lives, better relationships, and lower body mass indexes. So that ability to delay gratification is kind of incredible.
Is the idea that it's intrinsic or that it's learned very early?
Great question.
I say this as a marshmallow-loving 5-year-old who's concerned.
Well, that's the great question. So what we know is it wasn't that these kids had this higher moral code or they were even, I could deny myself. It was more of an executive function, the ability to sort of, I'm going to pretend that's not really a marshmallow. I'm going to pretend it's a picture of a marshmallow, or I'm going to pretend there's dirt on it and I don't want it anymore. Or I'm going to pretend I'm a superhero and I'm strong. I could, all these different ways. And now what the research is looking at is how do we teach that? Can we teach it? And I was brought up in an environment where my dad was a teacher at this time in 1969, and he came home and told my mom, okay, New York City introduced a new pension plan, and we're going to put away 50% of our income in this pension plan. So we lived in Queens, tiny little house. My dad earned like $30,000 at the time. They had 3 kids, a mortgage, a car, and my mom Shirley said, Harold, what? How can we save half of our income? We have 3 kids and a home. We can't afford it. And my father said, we can't afford not to. And that sort of set the theme, I think, of how, he approached life. And he was born in poverty. He had no money. And he was a child. I don't want to keep going, but there was there's a story about him where he was 8 years old and he felt like he wanted to make some money. So he sat in the candy store right near the tenement where he grew up. And in those days, people didn't have telephones. So my dad would sit, the phone would ring in the candy store, and he'd get up and say, call for Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones, phone call. He'd go out, and Mrs. Jones would come down the stairs and give him a nickel or a dime. He'd get a tip. And he was in a candy store, so he always used to say to my kids, do you think, what did I do with it? And my kids are like, you bought candy, all the candy. And he said, no, I saved it and gave it to my parents. And because he knew the delayed gratification, his parents wouldn't fight as much, and they'd have bread on the table. And that kind of, I hesitate sometimes to tell that story, because not everyone's Harold. Like, that is extraordinary to be 8 years old. But not eat the candy. But I think that kind of thinking for kids, and even telling those stories, kids love anecdotes. You tell them the story, they're like, oh, I could be like Harold. Maybe we'll make a little Harold doll.
We're going to open it up to questions in a couple minutes. So if you have questions, you can line up at the 2 microphones in the aisles. But I wanted to ask you about something else, because you actually, in the book, normally, like in general, I often think of good parenting advice as being based on openness and communication. But there are some things about parents' finances that you advocate keeping private, which I found especially interesting because my parents are divorced, which I think brings money talk out into the open in a very different way. And there were, in terms of child support and who could afford what, and it can be fraught, but it also, you hear a lot more from your parents, maybe because they're just talking through you instead of to each other. So what are some of the things that at different ages you think parents shouldn't talk to their kids about?
Right. I mean, I think that when children are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you don't have to, telling them what your salary is, to me, is just out of context. Like, they don't have anywhere to put it. So if you're like, I make $100,000 a year, well, then why can't I get that candy bar? And you could explain it, but I think the numbers are meaningless to very young children. I think as kids get older, I've been having a lot of questions from parents. My 16-year-old wants to know how much I make, and should I tell her or not? And in those cases, I think particularly if you're there, you start thinking, and this one mom we were talking about it, and she realized, because her daughter was nervous about college, would she be able to afford it? Would she be able to, should she try to get into the best school, or would she just not be able to go? So those kind of, I think those, but I think you don't have to tell well, the ideal is not to fight in front of your kids about money. They actually said that when parents fight a lot in front of their kids about money, those kids are 3 times more likely to have $500 or more in credit card debt in college. I think that trying to, you don't have to talk to your kids about, it's just got to be age appropriate. Like, oh, my 401k went down. They don't care. or I'm frightened about paying for college. There's anxiety that can be passed along to kids. I don't think it's a healthy thing.
Yeah, the balance between being conscientious and being anxious. Kids pick up on that worry and
definitely.
Yeah. And on that wonderful, happy note, let's take it to the audience. You can maybe turn those things around. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
okay, great.
Speak into it.
So first of all, I want to say thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Some number of years ago, I won't say how many, I managed to get a copy of Get a Financial Life.
Aww.
And it helped me tremendously.
Thank you.
In my 20s, so thank you. I've been flipping through the book for the first time just now, and I think one of the things, like, we can acknowledge that Google pays ridiculously well, right? Nobody here deserves to make nearly as much money as they do. So I think a lot of Googlers are in a fairly...
There'll be a hat in the back.
And so I see things in your book about, like, don't worry about keeping up with the Kardashians, don't buy your kid a car. I think, just my own experience, right? Those weren't options growing up.
Absolutely.
And, as parent, my kids are 10 and 12, we're at this point where, like, gosh, a lot of your friends have all this stuff. And it's certainly, it's a want, but it's certainly, like, within the range of affordability for us, and sort of figuring out that line between, am I denying you and making you an outcast socially for things that you could be doing? I mean, every high school kid in my town has a car, and...
Interesting.
The idea of not doing that. So I'm sort of curious on how you make that trade-off, if you have any information on, like, teaching kids the hard lessons versus, like, making them an outcast, that sort of thing.
Oh, I love that question, and I've heard it in different communities, and I think that a lot of people who grew up middle class or, really struggling, and then you're at Google, or you're making a lot of money, or you have a lot of money, it's very difficult. Personally, I'm all about denial to my children. Not completely, but my daughter was the last one to get her cell phone, and I think it was so ingrained in me, like, these values in my head, and also I'm writing about this, to be fair, but I think that by the time, I think delaying, first of all, just as a mom, I'm saying this, in much technology is so much better, because kids are still reading books, and they're still communicating and talking and looking you in the eye. And I think that, my classic story was when my daughter, who's now 21, when she was 13, she said, I'm going with some friends. We live in Manhattan. We're going to go, can we go to Macy's? And we were a little overprotective. She was our first child. And we're like, okay, you can go. And she's like, and all my friends have a credit card, like their parents' credit card. Or one was a debit card. And the parents, they were good parents. They gave them a limit. But I said, absolutely not. I said, I'm going to give you cash. And she's like, all right. She didn't, she was a little embarrassed. But she went and she used cash. And she said, you know what, you gave me $100, Mom, and it was $103, so I had to put something back. Whereas if you hand your kid a card, prepaid card even, you can put it exactly to the limit, but often it's like off of your account, and if your kid comes back and spends $120, you're like, oh, good job, you didn't spend $4,000, And I think that the cash and talking about it with kids, because, and it's trickier with everything now, with Venmo, and I just felt up through college, they did not need to have experiences with plastic. And I think parents also, one interesting thing I've been hearing is that, but we're worried about our kids not having a credit report or a credit record. And that, to me, feels very insidious in that the notion of you will get a credit card when you graduate from college. There will not be a problem getting a credit card. And I think just because now it's Credit Karma, which I like, you get it for free, your credit score, but I think that people are rushing it too much. So I think if you talk and say, I know you're the last one in your grade to get a phone, and that's just the way we feel, and we understand it could be hard, I understand, but and yeah, those people, I always hear often like, oh, those people have a summer house, or those people have, and it's like, we have such a good family. We're so lucky, and everybody makes different choices, and this is the choice we make, and we love you just as much. And those, it sounds so trite, right? And you don't have to say yes. It's like, yeah, it's really trite. No, but that idea of those kind of conversations. And again, I was lucky, my family, we had those conversations, and my husband and I still have those conversations with our kids, and just explaining. And I have to say, when I see the next phase, and I've been interviewing lots of kids, kids 21, 22, and talking about it, and some of you are probably close to that age, and the whole, I'm not really, your generation, by the way, the millennial generation has much less credit card debt than Gen Xers in their 20s or baby boomers in their 20s. And that's probably because in 2009, President Obama passed the CARD Act, which said you have to be 21 to get a credit card in college unless a parent co-signs. Never do that. Never co-sign a credit card with your kid. I've met so many parents who said, yeah, ruined my credit rating. My kid used my card. So never do that. And also I would say wait till junior year in college before, or suggest to them, okay, if you have a job, you can get a credit card, pay it off immediately. But personally, I've seen, freshman year, they have to do laundry for the first time. Not all kids, but my kids, they had to do laundry. And there's a lot going on freshman year. They're studying hard and they're trying to figure it all out. And I think adding credit to the mix, again, when I graduated in 1986 from college, 86 from college, everyone I knew had lots of credit card debt because it was handed out. Someone's like, yeah, I went to a frat party, I got a credit card. It was just like handed out. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
Hi, I've been trying to figure out how to ask this question. I think the marshmallow example is probably the best way to do it.
Please.
There's probably not hard data on it, but I was just wondering if you had an opinion on it based on your knowledge. What's too early? Like, it's very tempting for my kid, who's just very responsive to all kinds of different things we throw at him. It's very tempting to say, like, okay, you know what, you're 2. Here's a marshmallow, and let's see you fail, and and then we'll try again in a few months. Maybe that's a little damaging, and I'm wondering if you have a thought on that.
That's another great real question. So when I was reading about the marshmallow experiment, and I looked at his original papers, and then I went online, and there are like all these parents, here's a marshmallow, but don't eat it. And these kids are like, oh my goodness, why? I want it. And I, wrote in the book, like, you just want to go buy a bag of marshmallows and go into the covers and eat them yourself. So I think it's a great question. I'm happy and I pride myself on my book being research-based, but I think when you're looking at being a parent and sometimes it's better not to have the research in your head. And I think, certainly my dad didn't have any of that research in his head. And it's sort of like, I think with that knowledge sometimes can come anxiety, like, where does my kid fall on the scale? And I gotta tell you, this is something my mom would say all the time. There are always bumps in the roads with kids, and they're so great. Oh, the teacher said they're not paying attention. Oh, because they're writing math code under the desk in second grade. Whatever it is. I made that up. My child does not write math code in second grade. But I think that I strongly believe it's good to know this stuff and to think about it a little bit. And it's fun, like, when it crops up. You're like, oh, but I would not be testing kids because they'll start getting a little anxious probably, or feeling that, oh, I'm being tested. So I would say it's just the parenting, the daily life of parenting. Wow, look at that house. That's a beautiful house. One day, maybe if we save up a lot of money, maybe we'll get that house. Or yeah, we saved a lot, so we're going on a vacation. I'm so excited. Just making it a sort of part of everyday conversation in life. And it does take more effort for your generation to do that, because again, you're not saying, let's take a trip to the bank, or I don't know, opening a bank account is a great thing to do. But I mean, the interest rate is 0.1%, but that's almost besides the point in terms of just having that experience of going to a bank. I mean, some banks still have passbook savings accounts, and of course make sure they don't have fees, because your kid will put in $10 and then it's gone the next month. But is that helpful at all?
Hello. So my wife and I have a disagreement. I've started paying my 8-year-old for each time he practices the piano. I give him a dime each time he does it, and if he does it for a whole week, I give him $1. She thinks it takes some of the joy out of playing the piano because he's doing it for money now.
Perhaps it enhances the joy.
I think so. So what do you think about paying kids for chores in general?
Yeah, I mean, again, the research, when you look at sort of the idea of doing chores, now that's different because piano, so when you're talking about chores, I think it's not a good idea to tie regular family chores. Like everybody has to have a job. I used to load the dishwasher, empty the dishwasher, and make my bed, whatever it is, that's something I had to do. If you're talking about one-off things like, okay, could you, I don't know, I haven't lived in a house in a long time. What do you do? Like get the leaves out of the whatever?
Clean a garage?
Clean the garage, exactly.
I mean, an interesting distinction you make in the book is that you can pay children for chores that if they weren't doing it, you might hire someone to do.
Exactly.
But the regular maintenance
The regular
stuff,
maintenance. So where does piano fit into that? I feel like...
Is that like paying for studying?
I think it's a little like paying for grades, which, again, Roland Fryer's randomized controlled study showed on average, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't help. Now, he also found, which is if you're talking about small one-off projects, so maybe it would fit into like, just complete it that day. If you complete it 5 times, I'm going to reward you at the end of the week. I mean, he was saying that can help a child achieve a small-term goal. But at the end of the day, and it's funny, my husband and I had this one, because when I was a kid, I took piano lessons, and now I can't, 8 years, and now I can't play a thing. He was more like improvisational and played when he felt like it. And 2 of our 3 kids ended up being like that. And I was sort of nervous, like, why are they taking piano lessons? So I think that I would, in your case, probably side with your wife. Sorry. We could call her on the phone. Guess what? But in the sense that in the end, the point of it is they're loving playing piano, and I think that no matter what value you give to it, you want the value for your child to eventually come from them. And I pretty strongly feel that in my control group of 3, and then my brother and me, like when it was sort of demanded or paid for, or we weren't paid for it, but just that maybe that probably if your child was being paid for it, maybe there's something else they would pick that they really want to do, that they would spend the time doing. So it's a tricky one, but I would side with not paying for playing the piano.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Sorry.
you. Sorry. But you don't have to tell your wife, hey.
Yeah, it never happened.
Yeah.
You have a
Oh, my
question?
dad has a
You
question.
can grab the microphone for him if you want.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to tell you, first of all, I've been retired 26 years. And I was on a cruise a few years ago, and a guy was sitting next to me, and he said, what do you do? So I said, well, I'm an educator in schools and so on. He says, how long have you been retired? Well, at that point, I said about 23 years. So he looked at me and he said, how do you survive? Now, the problem I think that the country is heading into is the problem of people are living longer. And by living longer, you're going to need finances over a longer period of time. And if you don't have it, it's going to cause major problems, whether it's Social Security, you don't have enough, but it'll aggravate the situation. And I think we have to address that your children should be educated enough to save. My wife, we were married 65 years, and my wife and I went on our first trip, major trip, to Europe celebrating our 25th anniversary. But we were constantly, when she said to my wife, I said, we're going to take that tax-deferred annuity, and that we must do it, but I also got 2 jobs to supplement it. I ran a college entrance coaching course. Remember Stanley Kaplan? Yeah.
He was his competitor.
Yeah.
Stanley won.
Yeah. He did very well.
He did.
But he was a teacher in the New York City school system, by the way. He was teacher of economics. And Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader for the Democrats, was a kid in James Madison High School in Brooklyn, and he offered to give the kids free coaching course
The SAT.
if they do his mimeographing work, duplicating
inside
his
baseball
notes.
there.
And that's how he started, by the way.
Yeah.
Stanley Kaplan. He was teacher of economics. But anyway, getting back to this, it's crucial for our country's future to plan helping our children become independent and not dependent. I've had no problems being retired 26 years.
Just because
Okay?
you saved.
And it's something that you have to plan for.
And I didn't get that Lacoste shirt I always wanted. I opened one chapter in that, like I wanted an alligator shirt, and then my aunt gave us a bag of clothes from our like wealthier cousins, and there was an alligator, so I cut it off and sewed it on my sweater. And of course, this mean girl said, "That's not a real alligator sweater. You sewed that on." And I was like, oh. But I mean, those things you remember.
Yeah.
But we had such a great childhood, and I only have, it's sort of interesting how that kind of philosophy is just, I think, the heart of it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, gosh. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
One last quick question.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if it falls under financial education or more child psychology, but going back to the getting paid for piano lessons, right, for practicing the piano, I want to ask the other way around. Let's say my kid does something I really don't like her doing, and I'm willing to pay her for not doing it. How would that be done?
Right.
Should it be done?
I would also say that shouldn't be done because they have to learn. Again, I'm not a psychologist, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think in terms of, the stuff I've read, that it's the same thing. You don't want to say a child knows, well, if I misbehave, first of all, you're giving them a perverse incentive that, okay, I misbehave, and then I get money to stop it. So first I'm going to misbehave, then I'll get paid to stop doing it. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But also that it should come from within. Like I'm not gonna misbehave because it really bugs my dad, and I don't want to bug my dad because he's a nice dad. Or I want to, I think those kind of, again, you're giving an extrinsic reward or or disincentive, something, money or whatever, to change your behavior, I think is not a good thing for children, because that children have to understand intrinsically why it's good to be good, or to listen, or to stop being bad, and I think it confuses it. But, thanks.
Thank you, and that's all the time we have for today. But thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you. Thank you so much.